You're listening to the Tudors Dynasty podcast with Rebecca Larson.
When I think about topics that I've been longing to do, the Dudleys have been at the top of my list for quite some time. And well, that's because I was patiently waiting for today's guest to publish her new book, The House of Dudley, The Fall of England's Most Scandalous Family. Dr. Joanne Paul, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is such a privilege.
My interest in the Dudleys obviously comes from John Dudley's close connection with the Seymours, which I've learned goes back to the first half of Henry VIII's reign and Edward Seymour. Can you explain how John Dudley and Edward Seymour met and how long they knew one another?
This was in many ways one of the, I guess, sort of not quite discoveries of this book, but for me, it was something that went far deeper than I had previously realized, because I think we view the relationship between Edward Seymour and John Dudley through the lens of what happens much, much later and their rivalry in the reign of Edward VI. But they had a very, very long friendship. They met the first record we have of them being in the same place at the same time, they may have met before that, is when they're on the battlefields of France in the early 1520s under the command of Charles Brandon. And they're knighted a few days apart. And from there, we start to see a relationship and a friendship growing. They start to do property deals together, take the same sides in various transactions, and politically and religiously as well. We start to see a connection between the two families as they grow. And so when Henry VIII dies, it's very, very clear to all of those watching and observing and recording that it's going to be not just Edward Seymour who sort of has the primacy, but this regime that involves the pair of them very much. And we can see that in that famous painting of Edward VI and Henry VIII on his deathbed, pointing to his son. Next to Edward VI, standing next to him is Edward Seymour, but next to him, the first man sort of sat kneeling next to Edward Seymour is John Dudley. So it is very much the pair of them.
One thing that I really took from your book was maybe how competitive John Dudley was with Edward Seymour, because Edward seemed to continually rise ahead of him. Do you think there was some jealousy there?
Oh, that's such a fascinating question. I mean, I always saw it as lacking that sort of jealousy and competition, but it absolutely could have. I mean, I guess from Dudley's point of view, and this is something I sort of put in the book, there wouldn't really be an expectation that he would rise to the level of Edward Seymour. I mean, after all, Edward Seymour was uncle to the heir and then to the king, whereas John Dudley was the son of an executed traitor. So why would he rise that far? And I think for the majority of their friendship, which, as I said, stretches across decades, I don't see that sort of competition. John is continually one step behind Seymour in promotion. As Seymour leaves a position and moves to a higher one, John seems to take that position, which suggests a friendship between them, that Seymour was recommending him. And we have some letters where Seymour is recommending Dudley. So I don't think that necessarily was the case for much of their friendship. Of course, there is a suggestion as we move towards the end of the reign of Henry VIII and into the reign of Edward VI that there might start to be a rivalry. And some of the ambassadors, for instance, suggest that their personalities wouldn't mesh very well, that there would be conflict that would come from their very different personalities. But even when they do clash, and even when Seymour falls the first time, John wants, I think, to rehabilitate him, to bring him back in. He has every opportunity to have him executed, to take his place, and in fact defends him against those who would see him executed. So I think it's only much, much later that we have a real competitive rivalry between the two. And actually, I think it's a wonderful, really interesting story of this long, really loyal friendship that exists before it.
I think you and I could have a 3-hour-long podcast where we just talk about the Seymours and the Dudleys.
Maybe we should.
It's just so fascinating to me, but I don't want to dwell on that specific part of it for too long because I really want to go back to Edmund Dudley, because you had mentioned John's father had been executed, and that was something that he just kind of lived with his entire life. So maybe can we start with a bit of backstory on Edmund so that the listeners get an understanding of who he really was? Because I didn't really know before this book. So where did he come from and how did he earn his position with Henry VII?
I think it's such a good point. We tend to think about Epsom and Dudley, and they're just these sort of conniving ministers of a very miserly Henry VII, and we don't actually ask many questions about who they were. I mean, I certainly didn't. Edmund was the eldest son of a younger son of a baron, so had some position. He was a gentleman, but not much beyond that. He'd been born in probably 1462, so sort of mid to late 15th century. Had therefore seen much of the Wars of the Roses. I talk about his grandfather in particular switching sides periodically. So there's a suggestion that Edmund may have learned from that a little bit about how to be sort of politique. And he trained in the law. He seemed to have been fairly well known, in particular in fairly obscure laws to do with the king's prerogative, which may have seemed largely academic to those around him, but of course ended up being very, very important to his rise later on. And he'd held various positions, both in the county, largely in Sussex, as well as in London. But there was nothing about his trajectory that suggested he would become as important to history as, of course, we know he was. The real shift happens in about 1504 or shortly before that, when Henry VII is getting older. He's lost Arthur, his eldest son. He's lost his wife. It's looking like his heir. He will only have the one heir, really one son in Henry, later Henry VIII, and is starting to get a bit anxious, paranoid about the precarity of that position. He's also at this point losing some of his most trusted advisors, perhaps most importantly, Reginald Bray. And Bray has some connections with Edmund's family, his father. And so it seems probable that Bray suggests Edmund Dudley to Henry VII as someone who could be helpful to him. And so we see Edmund turning down a position that would have made sense for his previous trajectory, instead becoming Speaker of the House and starting to work very closely with Henry VII and opening his account book in late 1504. And from that point is really tasked with collecting money for the king.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but he really seemed kind of surprised by his downfall. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, I think that is a very fair statement and a very perceptive one. I think he was shocked. I think what we actually get a lot of shock from the records of Edmund Dudley that we have. He seems shocked when people are questioning him, shocked especially when they're questioning either the king's will or his execution of the king's will. There's this sort of indignation that we get from him at various points when people are suggesting that he's not acting in accordance with what the king would want. And yes, he does seem surprised that perhaps not that they come for him. I mean, I think he knew he had enemies, but that they're so successful in their attempt to bring him down. And in some ways that seems entirely fair. I mean, the what he's accused of is completely ridiculous. Like, they do entirely make it up. And they do choose him and Epsom as the scapegoats for the previous reign. When, you know, it could have been anybody. It's just they were the most unpopular, and they had the fewest connections to protect them. But I think he's someone who, right is right. The king's will is the king's will. And that's just it. I think he was a bit black and white about things. He's also someone, I think, who you get a real sense of panic from him. I think he really wanted a way out once he felt trapped. And we see that in the letters, you know, he writes to Andrew Windsor, his former brother-in-law, requesting that people be bribed within the court to support him and to free him. He plans an escape from the Tower, which, when I read that in one of the copies of his will, I was just flabbergasted. I had never come across in all my years an attempt to escape from the Tower that the person was then willing to admit in their will, that they had planned that. It was, I had to read it 3 times just to make sure I was reading it correctly. There's this sense of real cornered panic from him once he is arrested and imprisoned.
And it seemed like for a while he was rather optimistic that he would be freed. And then there was this turning point where he realized he wasn't going to leave the Tower alive. What did his wife and children go through after his arrest? And what did he do to protect them?
That's something that's a little bit difficult to recover from the sources. I tried to find Elizabeth, so his wife, his second wife, Elizabeth Grey, and the children, John, Jerome, and Andrew. I tried really hard to find exactly what they do, where they go. The best I could turn up was a sort of receipt between Elizabeth, specifically Elizabeth, and a merchant in London with whom the family continued to have ties for decades afterwards. So I think she stayed in London. Clearly, she didn't stay at their house at Candlewick Street because they had inventoried the house and sold off many of the goods. So I can't see that she stayed there. But I'm not precisely sure where she went. But the children were quite young. John, the eldest, was 5 when his father was arrested, either side of. And then the other 2 sons would have been younger still. So it would have been a lot for her to manage, obviously. But she clearly does quite well. As we know, she goes on to marry the illegitimate uncle of the new king. So she manages through it fantastically well. He doesn't do much to protect them, best I can tell. Obviously, he makes provision in his will, though there's not much he can will to them because he's been attainted. So, he has no rights to his own property or to pass it on. John is later restored, but at the time he writes his will, he has no hope that anything he passes to John or Elizabeth will get to them. Fortunately, Elizabeth is an heiress in her own right. So is able to pass on eventually some of her own goods and property and titles as well. But the fact that he was planning an escape from the Tower, to my mind, suggests that he wasn't thinking of them much at all, because of course that wouldn't have ended terribly well for the family, though she does seem to have been aware of his plan. So may have been involved in approving of it or planning of it, but I wouldn't have thought it would be a welcome thing for her in thinking about her future and her children's future.
We just so seldom hear about the story, the other side of the story, how these families were affected by the downfall of the head of the household. That to me is such a touching, sad part of the story that, of course, it's mostly women and children, so we don't get to hear as much about that, do we?
Yeah, I worked really, really hard in this to try to recover the stories, the voices, the emotions, the ups, the downs of particularly the women in the family. Though, as you say, also the children. I tried to, because this is intergenerational, multi-generational. I tried to find a way of locating the children when I could. So young John has a few moments, attempts with young Henry, Henry Dudley later on, to try to give a sense of not just the importance of childhood and education and everything else, but this sense of continuance, because I think that there can be a tendency to draw firm lines, for instance, across reigns, or to start the story of a particular individual much later in their life. And so I was trying to show, so for instance, how the fall of Edmund Dudley would have affected the young John. I think that's incredibly important to understanding his choices later. It couldn't not be. And he reflects on it. We know that he was thinking about it because he writes about it decades later. So we know these things were important to understanding their characters and their choices. And so I tried to pull that out best I could. Sometimes it was speculation. And I, in terms of my writing, I use all the creative, perhapses and might haves and, can't have helped but feel a certain way, and, things like that, to try to mark my speculation while also making it flow narratively. But I was really inspired by fiction authors. For instance, Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth, when he gives perspective to the characters that are important sort of later in the narrative as children. And that was very important to me to bring that out.
You had mentioned all the things that John had gone through with his father's downfall, and he was eventually sent to live with the Guildfords, right?
Yes, yeah, correct. The Guildfords, yeah.
Can you explain why that family was chosen and how in the end it benefited John Dudley?
The why is difficult to uncover. I mean, the Guildfords were very well favored by Henry VIII. They were part of a sort of inner coterie to a certain extent, not so much as, Brandon or the Howards, for instance, but they were very important. So it was a sign of favor, a wardship, being awarded a wardship, which is what happened with John Dudley, is incredibly lucrative. It's something that people would fight over. I mean, by fight, I don't mean physically, but argue over. And so it was a sign of favor and something of great benefit to the Guildfords. So, just like anything else would be awarded, it would be a combination of some favoritism, and a sense that they were due it for whatever reason. Certainly, Arthur Plantagenet thought that it ought to be his. And so when Elizabeth Dudley remarried, the illegitimate uncle of the king, he, I think, expected that the wardship would go to him. And of course, it did not.
He met his wife in the Guildford household, correct?
John Dudley, yes. Yeah. So he married the daughter of the person who had been awarded his wardship, which was also very common, that the ward would then sort of marry in the family to keep that money, that property, any titles that they might carry within the family. And so it was sort of very strategic, but at the same time, it seems to have been also based, their marriage, on a mutual respect and love. Certainly, Jane expresses that in a later letter. And I mean, they do have a fairly impressive number of children. So there does seem to have been some connection between them.
Maybe just a little.
Yeah.
Well, there's something that I've been wanting to talk with you about, and I'm just going to throw this out there because I thought it was ironic when I was reading your book and I discovered something I hadn't really known before. I've always believed that John Dudley was instrumental in the downfall of Thomas Seymour and his brother Edward. But after Somerset was deposed, when Dudley sent him to the Tower, John Dudley was part of Edward VI taking on more duties and power, which was something that Thomas Seymour was pushing for. And in the end, it was something that was used against him in the charges. I just find that so ironic. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's fascinating. Yeah, certainly John contrasts with Edward Seymour in that John, he doesn't take on, first of all, the title of Lord Protector after the fall of Edward. He just becomes Lord President of the Council. And he's very keen to, as you say, give Edward VI more involvement and ownership in the governance of the realm, in preparation for him coming of age, which by that point was only a few years away. There doesn't seem to have been any love lost between Thomas Seymour and John Dudley. There are reports of them exchanging words. John seems to have been upset primarily that Thomas Seymour was given the Lord Admiralty, a position that John had taken very seriously, had loved very much, and had done a lot of work as Lord Admiral, that I think he was very concerned about Thomas sort of letting unravel because he didn't seem as dedicated or keen on the position as John had been. John, at this point too, particularly seems to have not accepted any criticisms of Edward Seymour from Thomas. There's a line in a report of their sort of quarrel where he basically says, I don't accept your criticisms because he's way more virtuous than you are. He seems very dismissive of Thomas. And I think Thomas doesn't have great love for John Dudley either. I mean, as you say, there are certain things that they perhaps did align on, though there is a difference of time too when we are thinking about, just before Thomas's fall, and then later when John is introducing Edward VI to more governmental duties. So I don't know if they agreed at that point that Edward VI should be allowed to take more on. Or that's something that John came to later as Edward was getting older and was starting to not make demands towards that, but clearly wanted to take more on. But yeah, it's a really interesting, the three of them really, the two Seymour brothers and John, there's a really interesting dynamic there that I tried to delve into, but I'm sure a more dedicated study could do much more on.
When I think about how Thomas Seymour received the title of Lord Admiral, and in place John Dudley became Earl of Warwick and a few other titles.
Yeah, I think he's Lord Chamberlain. Yeah.
Right. It does seem like in my head that was a huge tipping point, maybe in Dudley's dislike for Thomas Seymour. Like you said, it's always been reported that Thomas wasn't very good at his job and all of these things. But the title of Lord Admiral was a very prestigious and powerful title that I think it's not talked about enough, and how they were in charge of the court and they received money and they could do all of these things. And I'm sure that was a little poke at John Dudley to have to hand that over. But I also wonder, did he do it freely? Did he fight it at all? Do we have any evidence that he pushed back on the whole idea?
I haven't found any evidence of him pushing back, for instance, against Edward Seymour, who presumably was assigning these roles. He obviously, as we've said, sort of resented that Thomas didn't take full advantage of the role. And there is evidence that that's certainly the case. I suspect he gave it up with some sadness, but with an understanding that he needed a role that wouldn't send him far from the court, in time of conflict, which obviously the Lord Admiralty did various times for him. And again, he is following the footsteps of Edward Seymour, who also went from Lord Admiral to Lord Chamberlain. So it was a step up. It was the right sort of step there in terms of the direction towards the court, closer to the king. And he probably was assured that Thomas Seymour would carry on his good work in the position, and then was apparently frustrated that was not the case.
Yes, that was a good point. I always forget that part, that the Lord Admiral would be expected to be gone most of the time. So that would be a benefit to have him out of their hair.
Yeah, probably. They probably didn't mind the fact that he might be in Portsmouth every once in a while.
So we've talked so much about John Dudley, and I could again talk forever and ask you a gazillion questions about him, but I highly recommend grab her book, Dr. Joanne Paul's book, The House of Dudley, to learn more about the John Dudley aspect of it. And I know everybody is waiting to hear about Robert Dudley, so I'm going to have to shift now to the son of John Dudley, Robert, who most of us are going to know as, the eyes of Queen Elizabeth I. With everything that happened with Robert's grandfather and his father, what kind of childhood did he have?
There's been a lot of work done to try to recover his childhood, including my own. I did my best. I think some of it is based, frankly, on sort of urban myth that gets repeated. There's this sense that he was part of some sort of school of children around Edward VI. I found no actual evidence for that. We do know some of his instructors. He appears to have received instruction, for instance, from Roger Ascham, from John Dee, and from various others. So very clearly Protestant-leaning humanists. He seemed to have quite enjoyed mathematics and navigation based on what's said later in his life. But we don't know that much about his childhood. His elder brother, Henry, for instance, who I mentioned earlier, we have a bit more in terms of who instructed him and how he was instructed and with whom and so on. We're missing that for Robert. And that makes sense. I mean, one of the things I think we sometimes forget about Robert is he is a younger son, a much younger son. Quickly doing the counting in my head again to make sure I have it right. He's fifth. I think he's a fifth son, because we've got Henry, Thomas, John, Ambrose, Robert. Yeah, fifth son born. Thomas doesn't make it past infancy. So for much of his young life, Robert would have been the fourth son, which is still way down the ladder. So he wasn't terribly important to the family in terms of his standing or his education. But he did get one, and he got a very good one. But we just don't have a lot of information about his very young life. But it isn't until he is a young man that his father falls. So he would have lived his childhood close to the court and in relative wealth and standing.
So as the fifth son, he obviously knew in life he would have to fight for everything that he wanted.
That's a very good point. I think so. He probably also knew that he'd have to marry well, which he does, and that there would be no expectation that he would inherit his father's titles. Those would go to an elder brother. And although there would be quite a lot of money coming through largely the maternal line, his grandmother and his mother, it's he wouldn't necessarily have much of it. So the fact that he marries a sort of well-established country gentlewoman who will likely inherit quite well means that he knew his place, as it were, where he knew his path.
Do we know what the first official role was that Robert Dudley held at the court of Queen Elizabeth?
A master of the horse.
Right.
So when Elizabeth comes to the throne, he's one of the first, alongside princes of Europe, to receive a letter from Elizabeth, but really from William Cecil, letting him know that Elizabeth had taken the throne. And he rides with her in the coronation ceremony. He arrives at the court very, very early on, and he's master of the horse for most of when he's alive in her reign. This allows him to be very close to her physically.
Yeah, and for a first position, that's a pretty good one.
It is. Yeah, it is quite a good one. There's some suggestion that other Dudleys held that position in other reigns. It's difficult to pin down. Certainly, his father was master of the horse for Anne of Cleves. That's definitely the case. So there was some precedent for it. It is a very important, sort of prestigious position because of that importance of proximity to a personal monarchy. At the same time, it doesn't have the prestige of something like Lord Chamberlain, for instance. So it was a smart, I think, position to put him in.
I don't like to ask the what do you think or how did they feel?
Didn't they question?
Right. And I so want to avoid that question, but I know people listening want to know what your take. So I'm going to put a little spin on it here.
Okay. All right.
Do you believe Robert Dudley and Queen Elizabeth I had a secret love child?
No. That one's easier. Thank you for asking it that way. No, I don't think that they had a secret love child. I think that would have been impressive to pull off, to say the least, considering how many eyes were trained upon them. I love that rumor. I think it's super fun, and there are some great websites setting out this conspiracy theory, essentially. And there's also the one that she was switched that she was actually a man.
Oh, right.
Switched at some point. That's my other favorite one, which of course would make it more difficult for them to have a love child.
Right.
But, no, I don't think so. I think that there are all sorts of clues that were hungrily picked up upon by observers to suggest that there was something physical going on between them. I think that at various points, Elizabeth in particular said and did things that did not really dispel rumors that she and Dudley had a physical relationship. She seems at various points to say things that really raises an eyebrow. So I can't answer the question of whether they did have a physical relationship or not. But yeah, I really don't think they had a love child.
So this question is going to be my last one for you, because we've now covered Edmund Dudley, John Dudley, and Robert Dudley. So of the three Dudley men that we have discussed here today, which one did you enjoy researching the most?
John. Definitely John. It's a great question. I hadn't really thought about it, but immediately to my head was John. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is sort of a practical one. Very, very difficult to find many sources related to Edmund Dudley. I mean, we're very, very lucky. We have the inventory of Candlewick. We have his account books. We have the materials that he produced in the Tower, the letters, the book that he writes. He writes a book in the Tower. We have all of these things. But when it comes to very personal letters, for instance, there isn't much. So it was always a bit of work with Edmund. With Robert, in many ways, I had too much, way too much. I could have written a 3-volume book on Robert. There are things that I barely scratch the surface of, and things that I basically ignore completely, because it's just there's too much. And the other thing that makes it difficult with Robert is it is almost impossible to see through the layers of rumor that are circulating around him all of the time and to pin anything down. And I think he did that on purpose, not to peeve me off, but not to annoy later historians. But of course, at the time, I think he was a master of rumor. I think his sister helped him quite a bit in doing that, and essentially in manipulating people and what they thought, and always keeping them guessing. And of course, 500 years later, he's still keeping people guessing. So I found that really, really difficult. The great thing about John and why he was my favorite to work on was great amount of sources, particularly ones where he appears at least to really self-reflect and to be very open. Of course, it could all be a charade, but he is at least thinking about things very deeply. Everything from the legacy of his father to his sort of philosophy on court politics, his children. And so I was really able to get a sense of him. And he's one that I was really able to take through from a very young child all the way through to his death. So I felt a real connection to John that I didn't feel with Edmund. And I didn't feel with Robert, because I didn't feel close to Robert in the same way. So when I wrote the death scene for John, I cried as I wrote it and as I finished it. I think we try to be objective as historians, but especially when one is writing in this more sort of creative, emotive way, I guess I got convinced by my own my own writing of it. I felt really empty, like finishing a good book after I wrote the end of John. Absolutely found him fascinating.
Isn't it funny how when we look at these figures from history, we find something in them that's similar to us, and we so strongly connect with that. I've felt the same thing before with some of Thomas Seymour's characteristics, where I thought, I feel like I've known him for so long now, and that I've learned so much about him, that I feel this deep connection with him, that I can totally relate to you saying that you cried when you wrote John Dudley's execution scene, because it's almost like a part of you now has died.
Absolutely. And I really felt it's an odd relationship. It's difficult to characterize. There was a sense in which I felt almost parental, I think, because, I had seen him through his childhood, his introduction to the court, his marriage, becoming a father. There's a sense in which you are the overseer of all of that. And so you can't help but feel connected to them. There's also this sense, and I think it's one we as historians have to take very seriously, about representing a life, a life that begins, has its ups and downs, its loves, its losses, and then ends. And we think about it. I think it prompts reflection on one's own life, and how you would want it to be represented. I think that there is a burden that we should take very seriously in doing that, in representing lives. And I don't think there's anything wrong in that being or carrying with it a certain level of emotion.
We have just scratched the surface when it comes to what's all covered in your book today. And if you're listening and you are upset because I forgot to ask a specific question, I highly encourage you to go out and purchase Dr. Joanne Paul's book, The House of Dudley. Joanne, where can I find your book?
Yeah, it's released in the UK. And if you live internationally, like many of my friends and family do, you can order it from Waterstones and Blackwell's and other UK book retailers. And I think particularly, I don't know if I should plug a particular one, but I don't think Blackwell's charges for international delivery. So I'll just say that in a hushed voice. But you can order it even if you are abroad. And if you're local to the UK, I would highly encourage you to purchase from your local independent bookstore.
And I've purchased through Blackwell's before. I do recommend them too. So we don't have to whisper about it.
Okay. Don't want to get anyone in any trouble.
No. Dr. Joanne Paul, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a joy to be able to talk about this.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon at Tudors Dynasty.
Thank you so much for listening. A special thank you to my newest patrons, Louise D., Stephanie D., Ashley R., Taylor H., and Maureen G. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please head over to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty and click Become a Patron to see options. I've got all kinds of fun freebies for patrons only, so what are you waiting for? Head on over. Up next on Ask the Expert, Steph chats with Dr. Catherine French on domesticity and consumption in London after the plague.